so we're running behind time. We need to get started, so if everybody will find a seat as soon as possible. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We're thankful to have Eric Fridman with us here today, who is dean of one of the arts and science schools in some capacity. I'm not sure we read about it, but I want to not take too much time because he has something that's synchronicitous that we would like to know about. And so I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Thank you.
How does that sound? Can you hear me okay? Is that too loud? Not loud enough? Just fine? Okay, thanks. Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Early one morning back in August, I received a text from my friend and your fellow parishioner, Tina Harlan. She asked me if I'd be interested in talking to a group at her church some Sunday on the topic of thin spaces, which she said had been selected as a topic for the coming year's Adult Forum talks. I was stunned when I received this invitation, but not for any reasons you might expect. The night before, I'd been reading a book by the journalist Krista Tippett entitled On Being, the title of the book, that's her podcast series. It was Becoming Wise, an investigation into the mystery and art of living. In her book, Tippett describes a sabbatical she took to Ireland one year to finish a writing project that she'd been working on. She noted that the rocky coast of Western Ireland was a part of the country that the ancient Celts believed was teeming with thin places, or geographies where the veil that separates the divine from the human becomes almost completely transparent. I had never come across or heard this phrase, thin spaces, before, so you can imagine how surprised I was to receive that invitation. After receiving Tina's text the next morning, I called her to share this remarkable coincidence. I told her that I'd be happy to speak, but after we ended our call, I realized that I had absolutely no idea what I would talk about. But then it occurred to me, I'd talk about synchronicity, which is, after all, how this whole thing got started in the first place. Synchronistic events, or meaningful coincidences like the one I've just shared with you, really are wonderful examples of thin spaces. Over the years, I've come to understand that the synchronistic events I've experienced in my life represent a deep source of spiritual wisdom. Wisdom that time and again has provided me with invaluable guidance on how to deal with some of my most perplexing personal challenges. I'd like to start out this morning by offering a brief definition and history of synchronicity. Then I'll provide a couple more examples of synchronistic events I've experienced in my own life. And I'll suggest some ways that we can make these events and experiences more accessible and intelligible. But finally, I'd like to know if any of you have had experiences with synchronicity, and if so, how you made sense out of these encounters. Now, I'm not here this morning to try to convince you that synchronicity really exists. Some people argue that it doesn't, that it's just an illusion created by what psychologists call confirmation bias, which is the human tendency to pay selective attention only to those data that can validate our own view of the world. I like to call myself an empiricist. I believe that everything I need to know in life I can learn through my own experience, even if I can't always understand or explain that experience logically. Similarly, I believe that only you can decide for yourselves whether synchronistic events are real and whether they have anything of value to offer. The word synchronicity literally means together in time. One dictionary defines synchronicity as simultaneous events that appear to be significantly related but have no discernible common cause. The phrase was coined by the psychiatrist Carl Jung in the 1930s to describe certain extraordinary experiences he'd had while analyzing patients in his Zurich clinic. Jung wrote at least 2 articles on the subject of synchronicity. The first, which appeared in 1949, was a foreword to an English translation of an ancient Chinese oracle entitled the I Ching, or Book of Changes. Perhaps some of you have heard of it. The second article appeared some 3 years later in 1952 and was entitled Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Principle. I'm going to return to the I Ching in just a couple minutes. Here's one way I like to think about synchronicity. I've come to believe that our shared human experience is essentially a comedy, a divine comedy, to use Dante's phrase, and that living our lives with or without the benefit of synchronicity is a little bit like the difference between performing stand-up comedy and improv comedy. I probably should explain that. Most of the time we live our lives as though we're performing stand-up comedy. We tell ourselves and others long, complicated stories that lead to punchlines that we hope will make us laugh and feel good about ourselves. We imagine a clear line of cause and effect that transports us, or so we hope, from where we are now to some place in the future where everything will be wonderful and we'll find peace and contentment in our lives. We're all about the future in stand-up comedy, always thinking about getting someplace that's better than where we are now. Unfortunately, though, the stories we tell ourselves don't always pan out. Things oftentimes don't go as we planned, and we end up bitter and resentful and disappointed because when we get to the end of our story, it turns out that our punchline's not as funny as we expected it to be. This is when we sometimes make an important change in our lives. We decide to begin living our lives as though we were performing improv comedy rather than stand-up. We stop fantasizing about some ideal future where all of our needs will be satisfied, and instead we begin spending more time thinking about everything that we have right here, right now, responding on the spot to whatever circumstances happen to present themselves. At first, this transition from stand-up to improv leaves us feeling slightly disoriented, slightly adrift. But because we're no longer attached to the stories that we've been telling ourselves for many years, it feels like we have nothing left to lose. It feels like we have no ground under our feet. Fortunately, this initial disorientation never lasts very long. A friend of mine who works in the improv business once told me that she considers every line her stage partner hands her as a gift, as an act of grace. And because it's an act of grace, it can never be wrong or mistaken. For those of us who decide to live improvisationally, this is how we begin to think about whatever happens next in our lives. We recognize that what comes next is an act of grace that is never wrong, never mistaken, regardless of the stories we've been telling ourselves about how our lives are supposed to be. I've come to believe that an appreciation of synchronicity is an indispensable part of living improvisationally. Just as there are no mistakes in improv, there are no mistakes with synchronicity. A synchronistic coincidence, like a great improv line, exhibits a kind of inevitability. As we like to say after the fact, it was meant to be. A great improv line perfectly captures the spirit of the moment in which it's spoken, the mood of the audience, the line we're handed by our stage partner, even our own intuition of the direction that our skit's going to take next. Similarly, a synchronistic coincidence perfectly expresses the quality of the particular moment in which it occurs. It's an exponent of all of our worries, fears, hopes, and dreams. It's also a reflection of all of the conditions that, at this particular moment in time, define the world in which we live. A world that, if we stop to think about it, is really nothing more than our own projection of these same worries, fears, hopes, and dreams. Now, I know that this talk is getting a little abstract and metaphorical, so to bring it back down to earth a little bit, I want to share a couple more examples of meaningful coincidences that I've experienced over the years. The first occurred in 1984 when I was living and working in Atlanta. I remember the year because it was my first encounter with synchronicity, or at least the first encounter that I can remember. I decided to buy a house, my first house to be exact, and I was very worried about spending too much money. Buying a house for me was a long, frustrating process. Every house I liked I couldn't afford, and every house I could afford I didn't much like. This went on for nearly 2 months. One night, I was venting to a friend, and he suggested, half jokingly, that we consult his copy of the I Ching about my situation. I was somewhat familiar with this ancient Chinese oracle. I'd read excerpts from it in a class in college on Asian literature, but I largely had written it off as a relic of pre-scientific culture. But just for fun, we threw the coins. And just as an aside, the way that you consult the I Ching is by throwing 3 coins 6 times, and the particular combination of heads and tails that turns up directs you to one of 64 hexagrams in the book. I know it's complicated. Every hexagram describes a particular set of circumstances, offers an opinion on the significance of those circumstances, and offers some advice and guidance on how to work your way through them. So the 6 throws, my 6 coin throws, directed me to hexagram number 60, which was entitled Limitation. Now, I'm not going to read the whole hexagram, but I do want to read a couple of sentences that appear toward the beginning of the narrative. Here's what they had to tell me about my situation at the time. The Chinese word for limitation really denotes the joints that divide a bamboo stalk. In relation to ordinary life, it means the thrift that sets fixed limits upon expenditures. Now, this warning about the importance of not spending beyond one's means was not lost on me. After all, I was in the process of looking for a house to buy. But what happened the following Sunday was nothing short of astonishing. I was looking at houses with a realtor, and we'd come to the last house on our list for the day. It was a small, well-preserved 1920s bungalow. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. That's the very house. 657 Yorkshire Road in Atlanta. And while it needed some work, it was well within my budget. After walking through the various rooms of the house, we ended up on an outside deck that overlooked a large, spacious backyard. And to my utter astonishment, a long row of tall, mature bamboo trees. The first bamboo trees I'd ever seen in Atlanta, even after having lived in the city for nearly 2 years. The second coincidence I'll share with you occurred nearly 20 years later in 2002. I was driving my family from Chicago to Cleveland for my father's funeral. We were all in the car, my wife and 2 young children, with a funeral urn containing my dad's ashes in the trunk of the car. It had been a challenging 2 weeks for me, and nothing I seemed to do made it any easier on my family. Hovering just overhead were some unpleasant circumstances with estranged family members who were threatening to challenge the legality of my father's final documents. I wanted the funeral to be over and done with as quickly as possible. So it's probably not so surprising that just east of Toledo on the Ohio Turnpike, I got stopped by an Ohio State trooper for speeding. I tried to explain to the trooper why I was in such a hurry, but he was unimpressed. As he handed me a ticket for $150, I had been driving considerably over the speed limit. He gave me a long look, heavy with weight and consequence, and then said very slowly and deliberately, "Son, you need to slow down." Now, I thought that warning was odd. It was jarring to me, probably because I was at least 10, if not 15 years older than the state trooper. After we arrived in Cleveland, I sat down to read over the instructions on the ticket. I noticed the trooper's signature. I couldn't make out his last name, but his first name was Edmund, which had also been my father's first name. These 3 examples of synchronistic coincidences I've shared with you are pretty significant events that would be hard for anyone to miss. But a lot of synchronistic coincidences are a lot less consequential. A friend you've just been thinking about but haven't seen for a couple years steps out of a storefront on a busy sidewalk and almost runs into you. Or an old high school song that's been playing and replaying itself for hours in the back of your head suddenly comes on the radio. And then, of course, there are all the meaningful coincidences we never even notice because we're not paying attention to what's happening around us. We're so caught up in our stories and punchlines. We're so distracted by the incessant internal conversations that we're always having with ourselves that we miss what's right in front of us. How many of us here, for example, have driven home from work or from a store or from a friend's house, and as we pulled into our garage, suddenly realized that we had absolutely no recollection of the drive home? This begs the question of what, if anything, we can do to become more aware of these kinds of events when they occur in our lives. What we can do to take greater advantage of this wonderful source of unsolicited wisdom. I don't believe we can go out and search for synchronicity, much like we might go out and search for the perfect living room rug. In fact, I suspect the opposite's probably true. The harder we try to find significance in the events around us, the less successful we're going to be. Because synchronicity is an act of grace, synchronicity has to find us. Probably the most we can do is cultivate the conditions favorable for synchronicity to show its hand. We have to learn how to become attentive and receptive to an entirely new source of wisdom in our lives. So what can we do to increase the likelihood that synchronicity will speak to us? I've got a couple of suggestions. First, I think it's important to become and remain aware of whatever pressing questions animate our lives. Questions that rise to the surface and beg for our attention in moments of solitude and silence. Niels Bohr, who won the 1922 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work in quantum mechanics, once wrote that there are two kinds of truth, small truth and great truth. You can recognize a small truth because its opposite is a falsehood. The opposite of a great truth is another truth. I think the same holds true for questions. There are small questions and great questions. An appropriate response to a small question is an answer. An appropriate response to a great question is very likely another question. The question I posed to the I Ching when I was house hunting in Atlanta was a small question. To be clear about what I wanted to know, I wrote it down on a piece of paper. How should I go about buying a house? Small questions tend to be of the moment and involve concerns that typically accumulate on the surface of our lives. Great questions, on the other hand, are profound and hint at concerns that percolate up into our consciousness from the very core of our being. One of my favorite examples of a great question comes from a spiritual teacher I admire who expressed it this way. How do we live a life we can't hold on to? How do we live with the fact that the moment we're born, we move closer to death? When we fall in love, we sign up for grief. How do we reconcile that gain always ends in loss, gathering in separation? That's one great question, the same great question posed 5 different ways. I think it's telling that we've become conditioned in our culture to value answers over questions. For the sake of efficiency, we've come to view questions as obstacles to our progress, as problems that need to be solved as quickly as possible. We might be better served to think of questions, at least great questions, as mysteries to be explored, savored, and lived. One step we can take to become more aware of synchronicity is to pay more attention to asking the right questions. Because when everything is said and done, the right answer to the wrong question is not a particularly valuable answer. A second suggestion I'll make is that we strive to live these great questions, our great questions, in a spirit of what the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr calls contemplative inquiry. Contemplative inquiry is a way of finding our way through life that honors the value of both our conditioned need to solve questions as quickly as we can, and our abiding human desire for spiritual consolation and growth. As a species, we've become quite accomplished at the inquiry part of contemplative inquiry. We're really good at focusing our logical minds on answering whatever questions we encounter in life. At this point in our evolution, though, we might want to devote more time to strengthening our contemplative muscle, to becoming more sensitive to the quality of our inner and outer experience. To make the most of what synchronicity has to offer us, I think it's helpful to develop a disciplined contemplative practice of some kind. Prayer, meditation, yoga, or simply walking mindfully in the woods. Any activity that expands our capacity to see new things or to see old things in a new way. I'm talking here about cultivating that elusive quality of mind we call presence. We're often reminded that we must be present to win, and I think that's more true than we've ever really imagined. Shunryo Suzuki, the late Japanese founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, described the contemplative mind as a beginner's mind. In his famous book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Suzuki writes that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. Let's not forget that this is how we learned when we were children. A child doesn't know what's possible and impossible, and so can devote himself or herself entirely to exploration, experimentation, and discovery. Now that we're adults, now that we've become experts at life, I fear we've become less imaginative about how to seek new knowledge. I think the most important lesson that synchronicity can teach us is that our greatest insights come from where and from whom we least expect to find them. The homeless woman sitting on the park bench, the plumber cleaning out our clogged kitchen drain, or even our surly, incorrigible next-door neighbor who's never happy with the way we cut our grass. If we can find the time to sit in silence for a few minutes each day with a contemplative mind, paying close attention to the world around and within us, it's likely we'll hear a great question calling our name. Is it possible that for the last 5 years, for the last 10 years, I've been working at a job that no longer inspires me? How well do I really listen to my kids when I get home from work? And what is it that prevents me from hearing what they really want to tell me? What habits in my life might be keeping me from becoming the kind of person I want to become? Or probably even more importantly, from appreciating the kind of person I already am. Our aim in contemplative inquiry is not so much to find answers to these questions, but to allow these answers to find us. This is one way synchronicity can be very, very helpful. So these are my 2 suggestions for how to make synchronicity a greater part of our lives. Identify and live the great questions that challenge us to discover a deeper truth. And develop a contemplative practice that helps us cultivate a beginner's mind so that we can see the world with new eyes and a spirit of childlike curiosity. But I'm guessing that many of you probably already know this, so at this point I'm going to stop talking. I'm happy to respond to any questions you might have, but I'm really interested in hearing about your own encounters with synchronicity. What did these encounters feel like? And what, if anything, did you learn from them? Thanks for having me here this morning.
We've got a couple of minutes. Anybody want to respond to that?
Surely I'm not the only person in this room that's had this experience. Otherwise, I fear for my own well-being.
Bill?
So last summer, not this most recent one, but Chris got a number of us to go to North Dakota. And there were jobs to do. We were going to build some stuff. And I don't like to build. I'm really not very good at it. My dad never spent any time because he knew I was going to screw it up. But I love to cook. My uncle taught me that if you can cook, you can always find a job. So when I was a student, it was always easy if I needed money to cook. So I volunteered to cook. But I don't like to wash dishes. And it was perfect synchronicity because Lynn Collins and Betty helped and liked to wash dishes. So I made them all dirty, and the pots, the pans, the plates, and all that other stuff, and they cleaned it up. And I couldn't have been happier.
Great.
Anybody else? Gil?
One of my most educational learning experiences was I was on a train
All right.
All right. Tina?
You know, when I first heard you ask this question of synchronicity and what event in your life, there's so many that it's hard for me to come up with a single one. But because you're here, I'll share how you and I met. I was at a meditation group on Sunday nights that I would go to on occasion, and Eric came and he was new, and I don't know why, but for some reason I felt like I had known you my whole life. And we sat down, and there was this event coming up. There was a 4-day silent meditation retreat on mindfulness. And for those of you who know me, not my strength of being quiet for 4 whole days. And Eric was going, are you going to this? We just met. Are you going to this? You ought to go to this. Should be fun. And it just so turned out that I had the timing in my schedule. I was able to go. And so Eric and I attended this event, and it was transformative in many, many ways. And it's the beginning of our relationship together. And Eric, you have been so helpful in some of the things that I have learned and been learning and increased that. And we had these, although it was a silent meditation retreat, he and I weren't so sure if
Yeah,
silent
we got yelled at by the meditation teacher. She actually, yeah, oh yeah, no, we broke it in a big way.
Never.
She did not name us, but it was very clear she was referring to us.
Because our point of view is that we should be silent, respectful during the retreat, but after hours we should be talking about our experience of our meditation throughout and smiling at one another and all. And so her thing was you should avoid eye contact with people, and of course we couldn't
Not so much.
possibly do that. But it has been, but I had this sort of epiphany of what my next stage is going to look like in my life, and it was transformative. And had I not met you, Eric, and had we not had these endless conversations about that, that would never have come. And so it's a very exciting time, and I'm so grateful to have met you, and you bring so much light and inspiration and insight to my world. So
Thanks, Tina.
thank you for
And that's how I ended up here today. So.
Yes, I'd been working with Eric for many years, and we had a wonderful professional relationship. And I recently retired, and all the big questions are coming up now. I was working 200%, but then kind of stunning when I retired because I was stuck with all the questions that I had put off. And so Eric actually happened to talk to another colleague, and I found out that he was into meditation and Buddhism. That's something, Catholicism and Buddhism, I've been really trying to reconcile the two. And then Eric told me about this wonderful talk that was given by this interfaith Common Core, is that it?
Yeah, it's an organization in Deerfield. I can't remember the exact name of it.
And he talked about Thomas Merton and his relationship, to Thich Nhat Hanh, to the Dalai Lama, to Suzuki, and where he went on his journey. And it was just, I was like, oh my God, so there's been all kinds of this stuff that, as I said, we've worked together for years, and all of a sudden we're talking about stuff that really matters. And the other stuff matters, but this is the stuff that really matters. So yeah, I'm really thankful for that.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I had sort of two different things happen that both are, I think what you're talking about, synchronicity. One was that when I was in college, I was taking math classes and doing well and enjoying them, but going, what am I gonna do with a math degree? And here I am, like my one friend of mine and I are like the only women still in the girls are still in the class, and we're looking around going, what are we doing in here? We got to find something different to take and major in. And my dad, who knew nothing about what he was talking about, was a football coach, so he was not exactly the person to go for career advice. But so he tells me,
Unless you wanted to be a football player.
yeah, I guess there's some math involved in football, right? So he tells me, the world is going to computers, and this is in the early 80s. You should take a computer class, because his two pieces of advice were take a computer class and take a public speaking class.
Oh, wow.
So I said, okay, great, Dad, thanks a lot. So I said to my friend, okay, so we should take a computer class, whatever that is. So this was back when they had cards at Northwestern. You had stacks of cards with rubber bands around them, and God forbid the rubber band broke and the cards went flying. Your whole program was over with. So I took computer classes and did well, and it was, the same kind of thinking skills as math, and it was similar, logical thinking, linear thinking, and ended up majoring in that. And then it was 1985, and it was boom time, and here I was, a woman graduating with a computer science degree. Woohoo, jobs all over the place, right? But I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to be a programmer. So it was like, great advice, Dad, but like, I don't want to sit at a computer all day. So what did I do? Go to graduate school, because then I could put it off for 2 more years, right? So after going to graduate school and getting an MBA in marketing and going, okay, now like left brain, right brain, got the whole thing going, I was interviewing for jobs and had a job with IBM and this old company called Arthur Andersen, and those kind of sound like, okay, that's fine, that's a logical path. And then I had an interview with this company called Leo Burnett. Bill, you remember that place? And I thought, wow, I could work in advertising? That would be really fun. That'd be like, and I don't know what I'm doing with my computer skills there, but so what? Like, they want to hire me, so maybe I should do that. And my dad said, remember I told you, like, public speaking and computers, like, you could use your, outgoing public speaking skills and sell Happy Meals to, and that's what I did. I took the job with Leo Burnett because I didn't want to work with in a computer room somewhere. And my first assignment was on Ronald McDonald Business, and we, did research on trying to figure out how to sell more Happy Meals. So the coincidence was that my dad, who knew a lot about football and X's and O's and offense and defense, actually gave me this advice that I rolled my eyes at and said, Dad, great, that's really helpful, but you don't know what you're talking about. Was actually really, really insightful advice, and if I had really thought about it, he sent me in the right direction, and I wasn't stuck in a cubicle programming, no longer with cards, but actually on the screen, but still, I found myself to a happier place and something that fit more my personality.
Okay, well, there's one more, and then we'll.
I have one, don't need a mic.
Okay.
I was at a store that has lots of craft supplies and different things that I was finding down in North Carolina. And I checked out, there were, I've had a lot of these books and I've read through it, and it's incredible. It takes maybe a day. It's called the Jesus Bible, and it has a continuum of beginning to the end, how God is there through the time, how Jesus is there throughout, and how it goes all through. And I was walking with a friend, she goes, I'm tired of doing Facebook, I'm trying to keep up with this stuff, I've signed up for a Bible study. But I'm Catholic, I don't really know the Bible, they kind of always kept it. And I said, and I bought 2 of these Bibles, and I didn't know why I bought them, I just had them because people have little babies or whatever. And then my son had a baby, I'm like, well, there you go. And then I gave one to her, and she said, I said, this will give you just such a nice long continuum, how God's answers are there all the time. And reading just a little forward day by day or upper room or these little daily devotionals, kind of like 5 out of 10 times that you read them, those words you've read before all of a sudden like mean something right then. And I kind of cut them out and go, talk about synchronicity, God's word with what you're going through. And it's like, it's pretty cool. Well, I said I'd be short, but I'm not even. I'm done. It is really, truly fun.
It's a great story.
We're kind of out of time, so let's see if Eric.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.